Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville news, government, politics, business, education, anything that gets our attention. I'm Jesse Mayshark, co-founder and co-publisher of Compass, which you can find at CompassKnox.com. I am returning after a couple of weeks away, joined as always by Scott Barker, also co-publisher and co-founder, who kept the home fires burning and then some in my absence. Scott, thank you so much for all your work. How are you doing?
I certainly need the weekend to recover, but I'm doing okay. It was pretty exciting by the time while you were gone. So, there was plenty to do and plenty to keep my interest up. So.
Well, good. And you did at least have the assistance of our very able summer intern, Owen McCarthy, who we are sad to report is not with us today because he's no longer with us at all. It turns out that college interns have to go back to college in the fall. I'm not sure that we totally understood that at the front end of this. But no, if Owen happens to be tuning in because he just can't let go of Knoxville, just want to say thanks a lot, Owen. He did, Scott, I think, really exemplary work, and it was really a pleasure to have him here this summer.
Absolutely exceeded my expectations on every level. He was able to, come in and contribute to the newsletter, wrote some good stories, and really, he's from, he goes to Michigan State, but he really dove in and learned a bunch about Knoxville. And really worked hard, and so it was good to have him here.
And apparently, from what he told us anyway, nothing he experienced here dissuaded him from pursuing a career in journalism, even though Scott made him go to planning commission meetings. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but I'm glad that he found value in all of it.
Well, I wanted to make sure that he realized that journalism isn't all glamour. There's some
all glamour.
Not all glamour.
Where's the glamour parts?
I don't. It's somewhere. I haven't found it yet. I'm still looking.
Yeah, we're looking in the wrong places, and that's what we're going to talk about. The places where we do look, which is at local government, local elections, local politics. We have, let's see, there was an interesting discussion at the Planning Commission, speaking of this week, about a controversial new proposed development on the downtown waterfront. The school year started, and actually one of the last things we had Owen do for us was a sit-down interview, sort of back-to-school interview with Superintendent John Rysewyk. We'll talk about that a little bit. Knoxville City Council is putting an interesting referendum about city council elections and how we are going to choose our representatives on this November's ballot. So we'll talk about that. But, Scott, to start off, we'll continue kind of taking a look back at the August 1st election, the Knox County general election, and, of course, there were also a couple of state and federal primaries there, and you kind of went through and crunched the numbers. The top line story out of this election that you all talked about last week on the podcast was that overall Knox County Democrats had a pretty good election. They didn't blow things out of the water, but they picked up a county commission seat. They solidified couple of seats on the school board. So you kind of took a precinct by precinct, district by district look at what really went on there, and what did you find?
Well, what happened was, I was a little surprised, but there wasn't a blue wave. There wasn't, even though they took a commission seat away from Republicans, even though they almost took a second one, and then the school board races, like you mentioned, it wasn't because so many more people were voting Democratic. It was because so many Republicans did not vote at all. The turnout was abysmal, about 18%, and a little bit more than 18%. But of the 304,000 registered voters in Knox County, only about 56,700 of them voted.
Which we should say is not unusual in local races. We tend to see, 20 to 25% is kind of the upper end of what we often see in these local elections. Right.
And but what I decided to look at was, and it's not exactly, it's apples to apples, but it's two different kinds of apples. It's, Granny Smith's and Fiji apples. So, but 4 years ago in 2020, when these same seats were up, 76,000 people voted. So there was a drop off of almost 19,000 voters between 2020 and 2024, and the same seats were up. In fact, there were actually fewer seats were contested because of the several of the Republican commissioners were unopposed. But the big difference was at the very top of the ticket. Both elections featured a Senate primary. The Republican primary in 2020 was very competitive. Bill Hagerty, who wound up winning the race, and Manny Sethi, who was had a lot of support too. In fact, he won in Knox County. But they really drove the turnout. 46,500 people voted in the Republican primary in 2020. Only 31,000 voted this time for Marsha Blackburn's race, and that's because she only had token opposition. She's an incumbent,
and one thing to mention about that Hagerty race, it was very competitive, partly because it was an open seat at the time, and open seats always bring out stronger candidates and campaigns and so forth. Blackburn here is running as an incumbent. She was not challenged in the Republican primary at all. And so you're talking about an 18,000 voter drop off overall between those two elections, but 15,000 of that basically is attributable to lower Republican turnout.
Absolutely.
So the Democrats didn't really have a surge. They just didn't fall off nearly as much.
Oh, they didn't. Yeah, they didn't. And I looked at the law director's race as well, because it was the only local race that was countywide and was competitive both times. Last in 2020, the property assessor's race, John Whitehead, was unopposed, so you really can't compare it to this year's property assessor's race. But in the law director race, David Book won in 2020 with 60, and we had the same candidates, so that's very important. But Book won in 2020 with 63% of the vote. In 2024, he had 55% of the vote, so the margin was a lot narrower. But one difference is Book got 12,700 fewer votes than he did in 2020, and Finner actually got fewer votes, and still, he got almost 600 fewer, but the margin still narrowed because so many people didn't vote for Book, didn't vote at all. So, then the big victory for Democrats, of course, was the 4th district, where they won the county commission seat that was previously held by Kyle Ward, who opted not to run for re-election. Now in 2020, he was elected, and it was pretty close. It wasn't, nip and tuck, but it was fairly close. He had 54% of the vote. This time around, the Republican Garrett Holt lost to Shane Jackson, Democrat, by 170 votes.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was a real narrow margin. And what's really interesting, and this was almost stunning to me, was that Buch's voters in that district, just in those precincts in that district, Buch got 284 votes more than Holt did.
Uh-huh. So there were people who voted for the Republican in the law director's race who didn't vote for the Republican in the county commission
There were
race.
284 who, for whatever reason,
Right.
I don't know if they've, didn't vote at all. They voted for Jackson. I don't know. I mean, Jackson didn't get a huge number of votes more than Todd Frohmeyer did 4 years ago. So, but basically, you had almost 300 people in the polling place with a ballot in their hands, and they had already voted for Republican David Buch for law director, and they, for whatever reason, did not vote for Garrett Holt.
Right.
And so that's a seat, I think, that you could pretty much say that it's not so much that the Democrats won it as much as the Republicans lost it.
Right. Because
they really had an opportunity to it would have been close, obviously close either way, but it's a zero-sum game, and Democrats,
somebody's going to win.
and
it's interesting because the last election in that district was the school board race 2 years ago, which was also won by the Democrat Catherine Bike. So basically, in 2 election cycles, we've gone from that district being solid. That school board race was actually the first time it had been partisan, so it's hard to weigh that exactly. But that district that has been represented by Republicans for a long time, but had been trending, and of course, we've talked about it as kind of the most purple district. Bike won by a very similar margin. So again, a very small margin, but now you have Democrats representing that district on both the school board and commission. Now, it doesn't look like a seat that the Democrats can kind of, the first district and the second district, which were the 2 already Democratic seats, and both of them elected or reelected Democrats in this cycle. Those, I think you can say, those are the solid blue seats.
Right.
The 4th district still looks very much purple. I mean, this could clearly be won, at least right now, by good candidates from either party. Still, that's a significant shift. And then a somewhat similar thing happened in the 3rd district, right? Because in the 3rd district 2 years ago in the county commission race, the Republican Gina Oster just barely beat the Democratic candidate Stuart Hall, which suggested that, okay, maybe the 3rd district's in play here, but you always need more than one election cycle to really gauge that, because specific candidates can kind of change the equation. But this time in the school board race in the 3rd district, the Democrat Patricia Fontenot Ridley actually won by, it wasn't a blowout, but it was a decent margin over the Republican Angie Girdert, and that very clearly signals, certainly to the Democrats, that, okay, the 3rd district is also in play now as far as county commission goes, and I think we can anticipate in 2 years, when Oster's term is up there, that's probably going to be another very competitive race right there.
I would imagine that the Democrats are already trying to see who would be interested in running up there. And one of the things is that district has been kind of leaning that way for a while. Now, this is the 3rd district is from Cedar Bluff to Western Avenue, kind of at the northern edge of the city, and there are a lot of county precincts, some city precincts. So it's we've talked about before. The city voters tend to vote Democratic, and The interesting thing was Fontenot Ridley won every single precinct, and this has been going on for a while because you go back to 2020, and as you said, it was a nonpartisan. The school board race in 2020 races were nonpartisan, but you had Daniel Watson, who's an independent, running against Tony Norman, who's a former Republican county commissioner, and he ran and that ended in the primary because there were only two of them running, and Watson got more than 50% of the vote, so it ended in the primary. But so you had Watson, who ran as an independent, has been voting with the Democrats on school board. Now that it's partisan, so that was kind of an indication. Oster's race, she won by fewer than 100 votes in 2020, and then in this one, Fontenot Ridley won by 5 percentage points, which is pretty decent. It's close, but it's still.
I mean, she won by more than Jackson did in the 4th district.
And Jackson's district is arguably easier for Democrats. It runs basically the rest of West Knoxville. It includes North Shore Town Center, Rocky Hill, Sequoia Hills, Bearden, part of West Hills, that whole area of West Knoxville, and again, that was one of those things where Jackson took the city precincts and did better in the county in the precincts that were mostly in Knox County. So.
And let's talk about the 9th district, because that was the other race that we paid a lot of attention to. A lot of people paid a lot of attention to. There was, this is the South Knox County district. It includes all of the city districts in South Knoxville, but then also more suburban and rural districts outside the city. Has been represented by Republicans for kind of time immemorial, but there's been some shifts. The city precincts had been moving more blue. The school board race there 2 years ago was pretty close. And of course, we had the situation with a third candidate in this race, Stacey Bryan Smith. Nevertheless, it did end up being a hold for Republicans, with Andy Fox winning over Matthew Park. So how did that look when you broke it down?
Well, that was kind of funny. It's actually a close race. Fox won by 221 votes. Stacey Bryan Smith, who was the independent, didn't siphon off that many. He got 3.5% of the vote. The rest of it was Fox and Park. But the partisan difference between the city and county precincts is really stark in this one. Park won the city precincts, Island Home, Vestal, Lake Forest, Colonial Village, all those, the city areas of South Knox County by 2-1 margin. I mean, just thumped Fox there. But then you go out in the outside the city limits of Knoxville, in those precincts, it was the complete opposite. Fox just blew Park out of the water by 2-1 margin in those districts. So in those precincts. So when it was all said and done, it was a fairly even race, but Fox did come out ahead. And so yes, so the Republicans did hold serve on that one, and so they're, what all this boils down to is the balance of power in Knox County is still very much in Republican hands. The Democrats did win a seat. It came close, but politics, coming close doesn't really count. At least in the United States, it doesn't. But the balance is still 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats on the county commission. So Republicans will still be able to do pretty much what they want to do if things come down to a partisan vote.
Although I think it's also interesting that those 8 Republicans on commission now, the makeup among the Republicans is going to be a little bit different, because one of the successes or wins that you can point to in this election was conservative campaign consultant Eric Wyatter, who we have talked about before, got 2 of his candidates elected to county commission. Andy Fox was one of them, and then Angela Russell in the 5th district out in Farragut. She won the general election easily because that's a very Republican area. The real win there was in the Republican primary, where there were 5 candidates, and she came out strongly ahead there and now is on commission. And both of them were endorsed by this, I don't even know what to call them, quasi-group, quasi-organization who call themselves Knox County Conservative Republicans, which is a Wyatter-affiliated group, I guess you could call it. And this is a group of very conservative, I would say kind of hard right, more MAGA-oriented, Trump-like Republicans who are particularly focused on sort of national and state level issues, on culture war kinds of issues. And on county commission, Russell and Fox will be joining County Commissioner Rhonda Lee, who was elected 2 years ago, also one of Wyatter's candidates. And Lee has, in the past couple of years since she got on commission, pushed at some of those issues a little bit. About a year ago, people might remember, we talked about a resolution that she put forward that would have blocked any county funding from anything that quote-unquote sexualizes children. And it didn't really spell out exactly what it meant by that, but it was pretty clear from the context and the conversation that went on that they're talking about going after materials in county libraries, going after county funding for any kind of local organization or nonprofit group that might be involved with or even friendly or open to LGBTQ interests, kind of anything like that. They're throwing all of those things under this broad banner of sexualizing children. And that resolution didn't get anywhere. Lee couldn't even get a second for it. Well, now there's at least going to be 3 votes there, and Fox in particular have made clear he's coming on to county commission to be a culture warrior. Like he kind of, he didn't even talk about local issues all that much in his campaign. To the degree he talked about things like wanting to limit growth in South Knox County, he tied that to wanting to limit growth because places that have more growth and more density tend to vote more liberal. And the thing he really wants is to protect, to kind of keep liberals as boxed in as he can. And Fox is also an attorney and a fairly detail-oriented guy. And so I think you're going to see within that Republican majority or 2/3 majority that they really have on county commission, I think there's going to be some wrestling over who gets to set the agenda for those Republicans. And it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But, you have to say that Wyatter, who is not super popular with a lot of establishment Republicans, he has fought with people like former Knoxville Mayor Victor Ashe, with people like Knoxville Focus publisher Steve Hunley. He's not real close with Buddy Burkhart, who's the current Knox County Republican Party chair. He's a little bit of an insurgent force, but he's kind of chipping away. He's picking up a seat here and a seat there, and now if they hang together, he's got a little block of 3 commissioners on county commission that he can work with to try to advance, their stated agendas.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see, how much they will try to do things to bring in the culture wars and more national issues that county commission typically doesn't fool with, and to see if how much they tried, and B, how successful they are.
Yeah.
And there was one other race too wanted to mention that mentioned in our analysis, and that was the 2nd district school board race. That was one that was Jennifer Owen was the incumbent. She was an independent. She decided to continue running as an independent. Democrats put up Ann Templeton. There was also another independent, Pat Paulus, who ran. He's more conservative. Probably would have run as a Republican had he not been in the 2nd district, which is solidly blue. So, but Templeton, defeated Owen, the incumbent, and Paulus. She got about half the vote. The Democrats picked up that seat as well. And, this was another one of those seats. Fontenot Ridley won every precinct in the 3rd district and the 2nd district, which is North Knoxville. And essentially, she won every precinct except one. The one precinct she didn't win, she tied with Paulus, and it was the most sparsely populated district or precinct in maybe just about in all of Knoxville. It's it just runs alongside Interstate 640 and doesn't. There's some houses at the end of roads that go up up through there, and that's about it. There's really not a whole lot of people live there, but so she was strong everywhere in that district, and easily won every. Even though there was an incumbent, there's an incumbent who typically voted with Democrats, when you had an actual, someone actually running as a Democrat on the ballot, they got those votes.
Yeah, and it wasn't even close because she got like 50% and Owen got like 30%.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
This was the only race where an incumbent lost this year, and we didn't have very many incumbents running for re-election this year, which was interesting in and of itself. Yeah. But it wasn't even close, even though Owen had won 2 races there previously. And I think it really solidly answered the question, which has been a kind of an open question since the board's shift to a partisan makeup after a change in state law a few years ago, about whether independent candidates can really be competitive for school board seats, which had been nonpartisan for a couple of decades up until that point. And I think the answer is probably not, because you had an incumbent who had name recognition, who had been elected twice already in that district, and having a Democrat, somebody with the D next to their name, and not taking anything away from Templeton, who ran a good campaign, who raised a lot of money, who was really out there and was more active as a campaigner than Owen was, and is also pretty well known, at least within some parts of the district. Still, having the D next to your name in a district that is solidly Democratic, just like having the R in a Republican district, that carries a lot of sway, because a lot of people show up to vote and they don't necessarily know a lot about all of the candidates or races, and they're going to tend to gravitate toward whatever party they tend to identify with. And so I think that what this means now, we had 2 independents on the school board before this election. In September, when the new school board members are sworn in, there will be no independents. There will be 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And I think that shows that that's like the partisan conversion of the school board is pretty much complete at this point.
I certainly agree with that. That's I think the days of an independent serving on school board are pretty much over. I mean, obviously that could change depending on the candidate.
Sure,
but it would. Definitely would be the exception rather than the rule.
There are just a lot of advantages to running as a partisan candidate, including the support of the party infrastructure, which makes a big difference. The other thing I just wanted to mention, and this will be something to watch again in November when we get the highest turnout election of the year, because presidential elections are always the highest turnout elections. But if you look at the 2 countywide races, you mentioned the law director, we also had the property assessor's race, and those are offices that don't tend to generate a whole lot of excitement or attention. And so in a way, they're good proxies for just what is the overall partisan leaning of the county, because not that many people were coming into the voting booth with really strong feelings about the law director or the property assessor. And so you have a lot of people who are just going to go with the party designations. And both of those were more or less 55-45 splits between the Republican winning and the Democratic challenger. And that is a little bit of a change in the counties. You know, if you go back and look at presidential race results in the county over the last 20 years, Republicans not all that long ago were routinely winning more than 60% of the vote, right up through the 2012 race with Mitt Romney. That fell off a little bit in 2016, and that was a little bit hard to know whether it was just some Republicans who just didn't like Donald Trump in particular, because he has had that effect on some Republicans. That continued in 2020. Trump's vote share actually went down a bit from 2016. But then 2 years ago, when County Mayor Glenn Jacobs got reelected, his vote share dropped considerably from his first election to his second one, and he only won by about a 56-44 margin. And now we have two more countywide races, again showing that 55-45 margin. So we'll see what it looks like in November, but it's possible that what we're seeing, and of course this is what the Knox County Democratic Party has been talking about for a while, like the county's turning more blue, but we could be shifting from a county that we kind of talk about being a kind of 60-40 Republican-Democratic split to one that is actually more like a 55-45 split.
Yeah, but one of the thing, again, turnout has been going progressively lower, and how much of that is attributed to the fact that Republicans are not voting in as great numbers?
Yeah.
How much the election 2 years ago was a drop off as well. The numbers were comparable to this year's election. Jacob's numbers went down, but everybody's numbers went down on the Republican side,
right? Because their voters didn't.
Yeah. So I mean, that's the kind of an interesting thing, because if you look at the results, percentages, you look at who wins and who loses. Democrats look like they're making all these big gains, but they're really not. Compared to what it is the Republicans are just not voting.
Yeah. And that's why I think that the presidential race in November will be the real indicator of kind of where the county is, because anybody who's going to vote, that's the election they're going to vote in. And so that's your best countywide baseline, obviously, and we'll just see where that lands up.
So one of the questions I have on this, guys, is how do we factor in the population influx into this shift as well? Because, there's no question that we have a lot of new Knox County residents coming in, and how many of them are coming in and bothering to vote, which is one question. And then the second question being, are they bringing their personal voter habits from wherever they came from? It doesn't really matter. So is it that we're losing numbers, which is the worst part of it? I read a story the other day. We're 51st in the nation, state of Tennessee is, in voter participation. Yeah. Which is amazing. We're less than the number of states there are. I know it's a DC thing, but it's still it's not a banner I wear proudly by any stretch.
It's a terrible statistic.
But so anyway, I'm curious as we're watching this happen, how much this influx of new residents is impacting that, or if it's just naturally with the way that Knox County is moving more purple than it has been.
It's hard to know. Hard to say that. One thing that's clear is that the population is growing and turnout is dropping.
Right, we have more people and fewer voters.
Right. More people, fewer voters.
Right, it makes that dropping participation stat even worse because we have more voters.
Now, one thing,
actual numbers are going down, which means the percentage is even less because it's a percentage of a larger overall universe of voters.
But there's the one good thing for Republicans in this. It's not, because it's easy to say, it's terrible, they're not voting, they lost a seat, and in two other elections, the school board elections, one other one, because there was no Republican in the second district. But it's very easy to say, for Republicans to kind of despair over that. But as our analysis has shown, it's because their numbers, their people just aren't going to the polls. That's a fixable problem.
Right.
That's if anything, Buddy Burkhart should take heart in anything. That's a fixable problem, and it's a matter of getting the people who are going to the polls in November to vote for Donald Trump to also go to the polls in county races and vote for county Republicans.
Yep. Which is always the challenge, and it's a challenge for both parties.
Right. That brings me to another unanswerable question, but I think it's worth part of the conversation is, is this a candidate quality that people are just not excited about the candidates that the Republicans are putting up? Or is it that people are just not excited about politics anymore?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that it gets very hard to say on any of that.
Like, we're into it.
All of those things can have an impact. I do think the Democrats have benefited in recent years from being a pretty well organized, energetic, and coherent party in a way that, honestly, the County Republican Party it is not and has not been in recent years. And I don't think many county Republicans would argue with me saying that. I've heard that from a lot of them, that, and of course the Republicans don't have to be as organized and motivated because there are more of them. Yeah. But the Democrats have definitely been benefiting from being and the Democrats have a lot of young energy in their party apparatus. That doesn't necessarily mean they're getting a lot of young voters out because, again, Scott, what was our age breakdown in this year's election?
Oh, about 72%, I believe, 73% of the voters, at least in early voting, were over the age of 55.
Right. Yeah. So nobody is really turning out the youth vote, but Democrats have been activating more young people.
Although a majority of the people who were under 55 were voted in Democrat.
Right, which is where, if you want to, for the Democratic Party, if you want to look at where is their potential, it's there. Although, of course, as we know, many elections have been lost by trying to bet on increasing youth voter turnout because it's kind of...
Well, I mean, that's not even youth. That's like middle-aged vote.
I know. Right? I technically am in the under 55 category right now for like another 5 weeks. So, yeah, and I'm certainly not a young voter. The one other thing I just wanted to mention here, because I wasn't here last week when you guys talked through the immediate results of the election, but I do think it's worth mentioning that the 4th District County Commission race was an interesting one because, and it reflected the district that it's in. That's a fairly affluent, very well-educated district. But you had by current standards, I would say, the somewhat unusual situation of two, I would say, very good, very credible candidates who both ran clearly. They both raised a lot of money. They both spent a lot of money. They both got a lot of people out to vote. Like, it was very close. And they did it with a real minimum of mudslinging. I didn't hear about any real attack mailers. I mean, I don't live in that district, but I didn't hear from anybody. Seth, where that you live here, were there any of that going on?
I mean, so very anecdotal. This is my personal trip through this election cycle. There was not a significant qualitative difference to them to me. Like, you looked at all their mailers, and I agree there was not. I think I got one from each that was kind of this guy did this in the past. That was the negative kind of game. But for the most part, it's I am, and this is what I would like to do, and this is what I'm after, and these are the things I'm advocating for. They both did the one that I hate and said that they're going to do all they can on county commission to support schools, which is past the budget that the schools asked for, which is all they can ever do, which is one that drives me nuts personally. But as it's like, traffic easing, like the actual topics that fall under commission, they were pretty much the same on. And so it was like one of those, like, I kind of don't feel like I can, if they are true to themselves and what they're running on, both these candidates are more or less the same to me. And so, again, just to throw my person on there, just for the fun of messing with county commission and changing the numbers around, I went left on it. Because it was a complete toss up for me personally, and so just to see if I could help get this argument about the 4th District and its purple status and all that kind of stuff more messy, I went against my probably more standard historical. I tend to vote right more than left, but so it was, like I said, they were very non-consequential differences as far as I could tell between the two of them.
Well, and I heard that actually from supporters of both of them who kind of felt like, I'm going to vote for my guy, but honestly, we're probably going to have good representation either way. And so I just thought that we don't see that a whole lot always.
No, we don't.
In our local races or in our legislative races or in any other ones. And so it was interesting. And again, I do think reflective of that district, because it's a district where I think those kind of pragmatic, more moderate appeals just have more, are actually more reflective of the people who live there. Seth notwithstanding, I'm not saying that you fall into that boring moderate category.
I mean, I'm one of the 7 under 55s that bothered voting in the district, so I'm going to be special no matter how you slice it.
All right. Well, speaking of voting, Scott, Knoxville City Council, and we talked about this a few weeks ago when they first kind of talked through their options here, but they voted this past week to put a referendum on the November ballot that would change the way the city elects city council members. So what is that? Yeah,
they passed it, so we know what voters are going to do. Again, quick background: state law changed. Took away an exemption that allowed Knoxville's kind of hybrid voting system, where for the district seats, the voters in that district voted for their top 2 favorites in a primary, and they went on to the general election. The general election, voters citywide voted for those seats. The state law changed. If the city does nothing, then the next election, which is next year, the primary voters, or district voters, would vote in primary for the top 2 finishers, and then they would vote again in the general election. There would be no citywide voting for district representatives. The 3 at-large seats still would do that, but what a majority of city council members think that's not a good idea. They like the idea of having voters citywide select or vote on each office, so that each council member is accountable to every voter. They like that. So what they did is Andrew Roberto came up with this formula where we won't have districts anymore. If voters approve this, we wouldn't have districts anymore. They would be called regions. Same footprint, different name. And they would be, even in the primary, would be at large, determined at large. Now, each of those regions would have residency requirements for the candidates. So let's take the first district, South Knoxville. It will be, the name would change to the South District, but the South region. But now, in moving forward, whoever wants to run for that office will have to live there. But they run, in the citywide vote in both the primary and the general election. That believes some semblance of district representation, although as the critics would point out, it also opens up the possibility that the top 2 finishers would not be the choices of the people who actually live in that area. Because everybody citywide is voting in the primary. And there was always the question of whether voters citywide rejecting the top finisher in that district. It's happened several times in the past, not frequently, but often.
Where the person who wins the district primary then loses in the citywide general.
Right. And but for the most part, citywide voters do respect the wishes of the the individual districts. But so that will be the main question that's going to be on the ballot. There were some changes that were made to the proposal. One was first of all, the at-law, if this passes, all those races, if whoever is in the primary gets more than half the vote, they don't have to run in the general election.
So all of them could be decided.
All of them could be decided in the primary. We do that with the mayor's, the mayor and the city attorney or city judge races now. But this would apply to all at-large races, which, if this passes, all of them would be at-large. So, and another thing that was kind of curious about this is Councilwoman Amelia Parker had a proposal on too, and the key thing to her proposal. Well, first of all, originally she wanted to put a district-only voting system on the ballot. The real problem with that, because referendum questions have to be structured to get yes or no responses, and there would be the possibility then, if that stayed in, that both the district only and the at-large only systems could win theoretically, and then there'd be kind of a real legal
right. You can't
conundrum.
have contradictory referendums.
Right,
on
that
the
just does not work. You can't have an either-or question, and you can't have contradictory referendum questions. So Parker dropped that from hers, and then she also had a provision on tie-breaking, and currently for primary races. Currently, there's not enough time between primary and general election if somebody ties in second and third place, or there's not enough time for a special election. So council has appointed the replacement, the candidates to go, the candidates who had tied, they choose between them and send one on to the general election. Happened to Parker in 2017. She was running at large. Did not like it one bit's been trying to change it ever since. So now there is if this passes, there will be a provision that if somebody, if there's a first place finisher and then a tie for second, those two candidates would both go on to the general election. And anyway, what that did, though, it was pretty much gutted her proposal. So when it came time for it, she didn't even get a second on it, because everything that the majority of council members wanted that were going to be on the ballot was already in Roberto's proposal, which they'd already passed. There will be one other question related to the city elections on the ballot. All it does, it would ask if voters would want to move the 5th district contests to another cycle. Currently, it runs in the same 4-year cycle as mayor, city judge, and the 3 at-large seats. The other 5 district seats are in the other cycle, and it would just move the 5th district to that one.
Which, of course, if all of the council seats go to at large, then that would have less meaning.
Yeah, it would. Although the practical effect, if we do go to all at large, then the 5th district would be the North region, by the way,
right.
And the North region seat would still be grouped with the other regional seats. So it kind of works either way,
right?
But that won't be for a couple of years before that ends up happening. So,
well, and I know that, there've been various concerns raised about the proposed change to at-large seats, which I think you're going to write about some of the different points of view on this a little bit more next week. But among them are that, first of all, it takes away district representation, the idea that different parts of the city have somewhat different interests, needs, demographics, and so forth, which, of course, if city voters don't approve this referendum and we move toward district-only voting, as the state law now dictates, that would actually just make city council races just like county commission races and school board. Like, we already do that for county commission and school board races. You only run in and only vote in your own district. So there's the concern about losing some of that, the specificity of representation for different areas. There's also the concern that if you turn all of these into citywide races, they just get harder to run. They get more expensive to run. It's a much different prospect for somebody who is maybe, a community activist or a neighborhood leader or like a beloved coach at the local high school or whatever, but somebody who's well known within their community but doesn't have citywide recognition. For them to run only within their own community versus having to stage a citywide race, which it requires more money, more organization, more people. And so some concern that you're going to tilt against some of the kinds of people who have typically run for and been elected to city council seats, and more toward people who can draw on bigger networks of, donors and so forth. And
where that is a particular concern is when it comes to compliance with the Voting Rights Act. There's a lot of concern that as currently configured, the 6th district, which is East Knoxville, Mechanicsville, downtown, Lonsdale, it is a majority district. Ever since the Voting Rights Act, this was passed and city elections changed, it's always elected an African American representative. But the concern is that the choices of the district itself would not be, would not win citywide, and that it could hurt minority representation. The last 2 elections in that seat, Ed Gwynn McKenzie, who's African American, was the top finisher of the primaries, but then she also faced a well-funded white candidates, and she won the citywide, won in the general election. But one of the things is that that district voting does send a signal to voters in other areas of who that district wants. So, for instance, if you don't know anything about, you live in South Knoxville, you don't know anything about, people running for office in West Knoxville, you look at the District 2 results, see who came in first, and say, oh, it's good enough for the district, it's good enough for me. But you don't have that anymore. And
of course, these are nonpartisan races, so you also don't have the indicator of, oh, this is a Democrat or
right. You don't have anything,
or whatever.
You don't have anything, and and there is concern that it could harm African American representation. Right now, there are 3 women of color on council, 1/3 of the panel, and so. And it's been a concern under the hybrid system that we've been using too, because still you could have a district's top choice who gets rejected by the voters citywide. That hasn't happened in the 6th district since 1997. So there's not a history of.
And in that case, it was between two black candidates.
Two black candidates.
So it wasn't that you had, a black candidate who finished first and a non-black candidate who then actually won in the general. We haven't had that. And that's something that people who are trying to allay these concerns point to and say, well, this hasn't happened yet. I think the flip side of that is there's no reason it couldn't. And if suddenly, after decades of always having at least one African-American member of city council, you came through an election cycle and realized, in a city that has actually gotten more diverse over time, we now have the first all-white city council in decades. Like, that could clearly ring some
that would draw some scrutiny.
Yeah.
And now, one thing for these cities have been found in violation of the Voting Rights Act for having all at-large seats and all, have also had a history of not electing minorities to those to their councils, and that's a very key thing, because basically you won't prevail in a challenge under the Voting Rights Act unless there is a history of actual discrimination. Now,
one given election doesn't give you that pattern.
And so it would be a while before that could settle out. But like you said, this is one of the concerns from the hybrid system was that, and we'll take 1997 as an example. Bill Powell was an incumbent. He ran against Danny Mayfield, who was young, exciting, vibrant kind of guy. Powell finished first in the primary. Mayfield finished second. Then the citywide vote, Mayfield won. Well, and so there you're taking the clear preference of the district for a particular African American candidate, and then the white majority in the city picks the other guy. And so. That's a little, it's, if it happened all the time, would be very much a concern.
Something that someone might challenge.
Absolutely.
Well, we'll have more opportunity to talk about this ahead of the election because this is going to be on the ballot in November. So if you are a City of Knoxville voter, start thinking about which way you want to go on this.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So, and it's hard to really, wrap your arms around it and really understand it. It's not straightforward at all. It's not easy to explain it, even when you do kind of understand it. And so we'll be trying to keep people, we'll try to keep Compass readers up to speed on it at least. So.
Right, absolutely. Okay, another thing that happened this past week was school is back, even though we're still occasionally registering temperatures in the 90s, and by all other indicators, it seems like summer, not for the K through 12 population anymore. First day of school was Thursday. First full day of school is Friday, today, the day that we're taping it. And we had Owen, our intern, go and do a kind of back-to-school interview with Superintendent John Rysewyk, which you can find on our website. And what Owen kind of took away from that talk, and Scott, I think, is very much in line with kind of what we've already seen from Rysewyk during his first 2 years in the position, is that even as, like we were just talking about the growing partisanship of the school board and the way that, sometimes national and other kinds of issues are being brought to bear on public education, whether it's people wanting to talk about vouchers or talking about banning books from libraries and so on and so forth. Rysewyk has always been very clear that he as much as possible wants to kind of keep his head down, not get caught up in all of those kinds of fights as much as he can, and stay focused on. He has set out his 4 priorities. If you haven't heard them yet, I guess you haven't heard him speak anywhere in the last 2 years, because he recites them and repeats them every place he goes, and you can find them on his website. But all of them are focused on the kind of nuts and bolts work of the school system, which is educating students. I mean, that's kind of what they're there for. And he has this has always had this very pragmatic focus on this is our job. Our job is not to solve all of these other things. It's to do this. And so that was reflected in his talk with Owen.
Yeah. One of the things that I took from Owen's reporting was that Rysewyk really wants to insulate, not himself necessarily, but teachers and students and the school level people, insulate them from all those other distractions.
Yeah,
because those are distractions that can keep you from focusing on things like improving reading scores and things like that are the nuts and bolts, as you said, of education.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think in a way, none of that was new, but he's been in the job now for a little over 2 years. He's heading into his third year as superintendent. And I think we're kind of seeing his insistent focus on those issues and continuing to try to push at them. So, here goes another school year. We'll see what happens. Of course, keep in mind that school is back in session. And so if any of your daily commuting routes or anything take you by any school zones, please be aware of that. We did have, sadly, a hit-and-run accident the first day of school where a student waiting for a bus was hit by somebody. I think the last report I saw indicated they're doing okay, but definitely be careful out there. Other thing we wanted to talk about this week was at the Planning Commission, this proposed project down on the riverfront on the north side of the Tennessee River, right next to the Henley Bridge. There has been, this is actually the second or third proposal that there has been for this particular piece of property, but this is the one that's gotten the farthest so far. And Scott, this is a very tall building going in there that a handful, at least, of local residents really don't like, and they came and appealed the approval of this project to the Planning Commission, and it didn't go so well for them.
No, it didn't. We talked about this before. This is and it's really tall depending on your perspective. This is on the basically most of the block between Main and Front Streets, and most people don't even know where Front Street is. But it's right by Neyland Drive downtown, and there's a big bluff there. So it falls away from Hill Avenue down to Front Street. The proposal is to build an L-shaped building that with an entrance on Hill Avenue, up the upper part of downtown, but it would be 18 stories tall from Front Avenue. So if you're on Neyland Drive, you'd be looking over, or you're coming across the Henley Bridge into Knoxville, it will be a very tall building. It'll be one of the tallest buildings that's been approved in Knoxville in years. And it's going to be 5 to 6 floors of parking garage, and then on top of that, 290 apartments. So a big development. No matter how you slice it, it's big. Now it is in order to move forward. Their zoning's all right. They have no problem with zoning, anything. But because it's downtown, they had to go through the design review board. The design review board, it went 3 times to the design review board, and they made different adjustments, different changes to try to work with the size of the building and the scale and everything else. And they did make some changes to it. Primarily, it's different sections of the building will have different heights, so it looks like 4 buildings instead of one big one. On the ground floor of the parking garage, which is down Front Street, one of the things about downtown buildings is you like to have the ground floors be retail or restaurants or something to engage pedestrians. Well, there are no pedestrians down there. Nobody lives down there, and so but they're still going to put a retail space where they could do retail down there, and they could expand whole bottom floor of the garage to have retail on the exterior. But that's in the future, because right now there's no market for anything down there. But anyway, one of the things that this that they had to do was get the design review board to issue a certificate of appropriateness, which basically means it meets the downtown design guidelines. Fighting them tooth and nail have been the residents of two buildings, the Overlook condos, which are fairly new, on Hill Avenue, be right next door to where the entrance to this building would be, and the historic River House, which is a historic building that's next to the Overlook. Both of those buildings have really nice views of the river and the south, and then across to the south waterfront. This building proposal, the building would wrap around them, and they would have no views. Their view would be a wall, and those residents have been fighting, especially the Overlook Homeowners Association. They've got they're fairly well off and can
those are kind of pricey condos.
Those are pricey condos, and they can afford to hire people like Daniel Sanders to represent their interests. And so they fought it there. The decision, and what's key about this certificate of appropriateness is, if they wanted to, once they get it, they could just start construction that day.
Right, that's all they need.
They'd have to pull a permit, but the what the Homeowners Association did was they appealed that decision to the Planning Commission. So this is the first time it's come to Planning Commission, and it's really the only way it would have come to the Planning Commission, because the zoning's right, everything else is right. But and they argued, Sanders was their attorney, he argued, that it doesn't meet the design guidelines, and he went through several places where he didn't think that it met the design guidelines. And this is now, one thing that was interesting about this, it's I won't say it's unprecedented, but I certainly don't recall a time that city government has weighed in on an issue like this. And Rebecca Jane Justice, who is the director of urban design and development for the city, spoke before the Planning Commission, saying that the administration the Kincannon administration was fully supportive of this and urged them to pass it. Usually the mayor's office stays out of stuff like that, but they felt compelled to join in on this one. And one of the things that was interesting, another thing that is, again, not necessarily unprecedented, but and a planning commissioner take the neighborhood, the homeowners association to task for this. I mean, typically they don't directly address people and dress them down, but Katie Overton, who's a relatively new planning commissioner, Katie Overton just really slammed the homeowners, or the homeowners association at the Overlook. She said that, let's drop the pretense. This is not about whether it conforms to guidelines. It's about the views. You people bought. You didn't buy riverfront property. You brought river view property, and you're mad because somebody else is going to exercise their right to build on their property, and it's going to obstruct your view. And she said that she called it a bad faith appeal by a group of entitled NIMBYs. So
well, and of course, NIMBY stands for not in my backyard, and like on the literal level, she's right, because these are people who quite literally don't want something built in their actual backyard.
yeah. So anyway, there was a lot of discussion about it. A lot of probably the most amount of time they spent talking about it was talking about the type of stucco that they were going to put on the exterior of the building. I mean, there were some details like that they talked about. But the planning commissioners voted unanimously to reject the appeal.
Which means that maintains the decision of the design review board that yes, this is okay. They can build this.
Yes. Now, one thing though, it's still not over. They can appeal to city council directly, and that is exactly what Sanders said the neighborhood association or the homeowners association is going to do. So that would be coming up in the next month or two. Mm-hmm. So there'll be more to report on the newest addition the proposed newest addition to Knoxville Skyline.
Right. All right. Well, we'll certainly follow that as it develops. I think that's kind of everything we had to talk about this week, and this is now the portion where we would normally talk to you about all of these civic events and other things happening next week. But we've got sort of a lull in the calendar here. We'll have county commission meetings coming up in a couple of weeks, and of course another city council meeting in a couple of weeks. But Scott, what are we going to do next week?
Scott's going to catch up. He's been working hard.
I'm going to sleep. I don't know about you. I want to sleep. We'll find something to do.
We will find something. There are always things to write about out there beyond just what's going on from day to day. And also, soon enough, we're going to have to be turning our attention to the upcoming legislative races on the November ballot, because there's always another election right around the corner. However, for now, we're going to let Scott catch up on some sleep. I'm going to catch up on my jet lag. And I don't know what Seth's going to catch up on, but...
I got my own podcast, dude. Check it out, Opposite Agreement.
That's right. He does have his own podcast.
Shameless plug.
Thanks, as always, to Seth Barber for his production work here at Barbarian Productions. Our theme music is by Will Wright. We will be back to talk to you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.